We will now move on to late debate, the moment of interruption and that topic once again. For those who may have missed it earlier, as submitted by the Honourable Member for Halifax-Chebucto, is therefore be it resolved that the government could have done a better job at managing the issue of Owl's Head. We'll now turn it over to the Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to begin by expressing my appreciation to the Government House Leader for permitting the adjournment debate to go forward this afternoon following my misunderstanding of the submission deadline for late debates. Now, the resolution that's before us, while it may not be phrased particularly elegantly, is plain in its meaning and its intent, namely, that the government could have done a much improved job in the matter of its handling of Owl's Head Provincial Park. Now, key words here, provincial park. These are words that we use advisedly because regardless of the semantic waffling, which in my view the government has engaged in over this subject, the public has for at least 40 years had, and I'm speaking here in particular of the public of the Eastern Shore, for at least 40 years has had every reason to believe that the lands we're speaking of here were lands that in some respect, at least, under some piece of legislation somewhere, were protected by the province of Nova Scotia for future use. This was not an anachronistic or frivolous understanding, but a grounded understanding. Let me outline some of the reasons why this is so. Conservation specialists spoke in January at the public meeting of concern held in East Sheet Harbour on this question about the record of matters on the basis of which reasonable people in the area had come to the understanding that the government was extending some form of protection to Little Harbour and Owl's Head. They mentioned that the park was included in the June 1980 Eastern Shore Park System Master Plan as it was published in the edition that year of the magazine Conservation, which members will remember, many of us, a former quarterly publication of the Department of Natural Resources. Then in 2009, the determinations of the Colin Stewart Forest Forum were made public. This was a process that included over a long period of time a great deal of extensive public input and community participation. And in the concluding reports from the Forest Forum, Owl's Head was included under the heading Tier 1 High Value Conservation Land. Then in 2011, Owl's Head Provincial Park was listed on government maps under this heading, 12% lands for review, a government map series published by the Protected Areas Branch of the Department of the Environment. And then, more familiarly, in 2012, Owl's Head Provincial Park appeared in the Provincial Parks and Park Reserves map series. All of this was the case until earlier this year when that map was surreptitiously removed following the breaking of this story. And Owl's Head Provincial Park appeared on the online Department of Lands and Forestry map until that time, titled Parks and Protected Areas, a System for Nova Scotia. So it was therefore a reasonable thing that the people of Ship Harbour, Lake Charlotte, and Musquodoboit Harbour and surrounding area assumed that this was a piece of land that enjoyed some form of government protection. And this is why, despite the fact that some members of the government have found it surprising, this is why there was such a sudden expression of outrage and deep public surprise when people became aware of a plan that had not previously been revealed, by means of which the government was making way for a potential sale to a developer, when all of that came to light. So after all of those years of careful mapping, surveying, listing, reviewing, and public consideration of Owl's Head as a significant piece of coastline to be protected for future generations and held in the public trust for the indefinite future, the thing is that all it took for the government to reverse this 40 years of participation and public understanding was the few seconds involved in the enacting of this confidential something called a minute letter. Now, I must admit, Mr. Speaker, until this discussion came forward about Owl's Head, I had never heard of a minute letter. Now, granted, I've never been a member of the cabinet. Nevertheless, I've been around this work for a number of years. It's never a category that I had at least heard about. And I find that I'm not alone. Last Thursday, there was, on the opening day of the legislature, a demonstration of 150, 200 or so people here expressing their concerns about the government's action in the Owl's Head case. And I had the occasion to speak to that demonstration and asking about this understanding. I said, so this was true of me. I never heard of a minute letter. Is there anybody here who could put up their hand who's ever heard of a minute letter before? There wasn't. Well, no, I was saying in the demonstration, but I'm pleased. I'm pleased at the familiarity with parliamentary procedure of a number of the opposite members. But when I asked that question, there weren't any hands went up. At the time this happened, you know, I asked Siri about this. You know, Siri, what's the story? Siri, what's the story on a minute letter? Now, Siri generally has got something to say to me, but Siri had no answer. And Siri's first cousin, Mr. Google, Mr. Google didn't have any answer either. That's because a minute letter is a thing that is of its nature behind a wall of secrecy and confidentiality in a cabinet. Now, after the revelations of December, which I will say again, as I said earlier today, we would not have known about in the public at all but for the diligent work of an investigative journalist. After those revelations, there were lots of people, including myself, who asked themselves, you know, can this actually happen? Can you have an area that everybody's understood for a long, long time is under a form of government protection, that it has all this documentation about this protection, and that the government is able to remove that pending status without anybody even being told? How in the world could that actually take place? But it wasn't very long after those revelations were published in December about what had taken place the previous March, that more insight came forward into the mechanism and the means of this process by which this had actually happened, and this was revealed what had taken place to the public, namely, that there had been a series of private lobbying meetings between members of the government and a former Liberal cabinet minister, Michel Samson, who states as his lobbying goal in the provincial lobbyist registry, and I quote, acquisition of and access to Crown land for Lighthouse Links. Lighthouse Links, Mr. Speaker, is a golf course developer. And so a picture appears of conversations which take place with the government, with friends of the government, which take place with ease and access and influence and, I would say, privileged consideration. Privileged is the word I use because it is privileged over. It is given more importance. It is given greater credence than all those decades of work, all those years of consideration, all those consultations, all those evenings in which people came out in the evenings to take part in public consultative meetings. All of that is weighed on the scale and is not given the same weight as is accorded to that series of meetings that take place with that government lobbyist, which lead to that decision behind closed doors. Now, I want to say that an important piece of this puzzle that's worth speaking about is the 2012 Our Parks and Protected Areas Plan. This is the document from which Owl's Head has now been removed. It's the plan assembled by our NDP government in 2012 that laid out the path to protecting almost 14% of the province's landmass. The strategy outlined a path to go forward beyond the current target for landmass protection of 13%. It was a very important document and a very important process. I would like to again underscore that it was the result of extensive public conversation, extensive participation from all across the province. Now, I just want to check, Mr. Speaker, if I might. Is it in fact the case that I have only 3 seconds left to say?
That is in fact the case. You are finished.
In that case, I will conclude by saying that the government has not, in the words of this resolution, done as good a job as it could about Owl's Head. Thank you.